We treat every single employee like they're the biggest master criminal out there and they're up to no good all the time. A very small percentage will be up to no good, but what you do by chasing them is you irritate everybody else.
Welcome to Compromising Positions. We're currently on a break back in September, but for now we're heading back to the vaults to bring you an unabridged version of our fantastic and extremely popular interview with Christian Hunt, the founder of Human Risk. He's a behavioural scientist and the author of an award-winning book, Humanizing Rules. This episode, the key takeaways are the importance of designing things for how people actually behave,
as opposed to how we'd like them to behave.
Are phishing simulations still fit for purpose?
We'll explore the ethics of phishing simulations and how to measure the success of cybersecurity awareness training.
Fuck your rules.
We'll go into how people really feel about rules they don't respect and how you can stop them from rebelling against your cybersecurity controls.
How to stop treating everyone in your organisation like a master criminal.
Why a one-size-fits-all approach to suspicion will be causing more harm than good for your cybersecurity posture.
And finally, I'm only human. Christian shares his humans framework to use in your organisation today. You won't want to miss this one, and if you've already listened to it, do listen to it again. There's so much we can learn from it. Well, welcome, Christian Hunt. I am so delighted for you to join us today. I have been a big fan of yours for ages with your Human Risk podcast and your book, Humanizing Rules, which came out really recently, didn't it? Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Well, look, thank you firstly for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So I'm Christian Hunt. I'm the founder of a company called Human Risk that specializes in helping organizations to mitigate that risk. And that's all about bringing behavioral science into fields like ethics, compliance, risk, HR, legal, you name it. Thinking about the humans that we are trying to influence in order to do that. As you rightly pointed out, Leanne, I've recently authored a book called Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance. Out now, published by Wiley. Let's get that plug out of the way. But my interest is really in thinking about human beings. Whenever we think about the challenges of say, getting an organization to be compliant or cyber secure or whatever objective you're looking for an organization or society to achieve, it's all about influencing human beings. We have to think about the human beings because you can't say to a company, be compliant and expect it to respond. It's the people within it that will determine whether or not that happens. So my focus is on behavioral science, the understanding of the real drivers of human decision making and thinking about how we can deploy that intelligently to get the outcomes that we're looking for.
Amazing. I think that's so relevant to have you on as a guest for our show, because when I listen to your podcast, literally I'm always inspired to do another talk based on the guests you bring in and all the insights you bring to the show. I almost feel like, in a way though, that this episode is going to be a little bit of a cheat episode because although you don't actually work in cybersecurity, your experience in regulation compliance kind of makes us a little bit like kindred spirits there. Because we're often a necessity in an organisation of cybersecurity, risk and compliance, but I'm sure some groans do follow you when you enter the chat, just like groans follow cybersecurity when they enter the chat. So how have you got buy-in for ethics and compliance, had to sort of really introduce this to organisations?
Yeah, so I think, I always say that compliance is the world's worst piece of branding, right? If you were trying to make something sound awful, you would use a word like compliance. Okay, it conjures up images of people, with some sort of jumped up little official with a clipboard, slavishly following pointless rules and getting you to do tedious procedures. So it's a terrible bit of branding. We make it even worse by then adding the suffix officer. Only time I could ever think of where the word officer actually makes it worse. And so, when I look at that, you're right, it does create these sort of groans. But what is fascinating about the objective that compliance has is that it's actually the same as lots of other things. Lots of people are trying to do the same thing. It's just in different contexts. Health and safety is similar to compliance in that you are trying to get people to follow rules. Cybersecurity is the same thing. It's human beings that you are trying to influence to behave it, to do certain things or not to do others. And so it's always great when I have conversations with people, because you're right, I come with this compliance badge and it is the world's worst piece of branding. But actually, when you look at the substance of it, it's very similar to other things. And what I find even funnier is that whenever I talk to people in companies, you always get this, we're very different. We're very unique. We have a unique business model. Our sector's very unique. And of course, on one level, they're right. But actually, fundamentally, every single company and organization is employing human beings and therefore is facing the same challenge. So when I look at you can look at the form and say, well, it's totally different to anything else. But the substance of what I do is replicable across a broad range of industries. And the questions I'm asking about how do we persuade people to behave in a particular way? How do we force people to behave in a particular way? Those apply in a range of different disciplines. And so that's why, I've called my company Human Risk. The book is about humanizing rules. For me, the focus is on the humans, and whatever it is you want them to do or not do is, yes, it's important, of course, because that's your objective, but that's the secondary piece. We've got to focus on the human beings, and the human OS that we all come built with is the same. We're deploying the same thing, whether you're at work or in your personal life, or whether you're working in sector A, sector B, or whether there's risk A or risk B that we need to have you help us mitigate. It's all the same sort of thing. And that's why I like coming at things from the human angle, as opposed to worrying too much about what is it that we want to get them to do. That matters, but the techniques that we can use, well, it's the same human beings we're trying to influence across the piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the rules and regulations and policies are often quite black and white. Having been part of a cybersecurity committee, we write rules and things that are you must not. But that doesn't reflect like the actual human experience of being part of an organization. What do you think organizations should be doing to encourage grey area thinking without actually risking their assets?
So I think the most important thing to do, and you've highlighted it beautifully there, Jeff, is to think about the realities that are there. We often design things, this is my big sort of theme, we often design things for how we would like people to behave rather than how they are likely to behave. And what I mean by that is we create stylized, simplified case studies or personas that we then use to write rules. And we love, as human beings, codifying things. If I can write things down, codify it, that feels like risk managed, job done, because I've told them what to do, and then things will happen. But of course, in the real world is complex and challenging, and things don't always pan out the way we expect. And so what we have to do is recognize the realities of people's existence. And I think very often we don't do that. We train them on hypotheticals, often hypotheticals that will never happen. We look at the black and the white. We don't look at the gray areas. People generally, I always talk about, murder is bad type training, where we send people on training courses to teach them stuff that is blindingly obvious. And if they don't understand that blindingly obvious thing, then why have we hired them in the first place? Where people need help are those challenging areas, things they may not have come across, situations where what they encounter might look like it's an innocent situation, but actually there's things they need to be looking out for. We need to help real humans making real decisions in the real world. Now, that leads you to a challenge, because often when you start to recognize the realities that are out there, it becomes much harder to codify things. Now, if you're looking at something that involves the laws of physics, a simple example would be if you're talking about mixing water and electricity, that is a risk come what may. And therefore we can codify that, because what happens in the physical world is predictable. We know those things, broadly speaking. But when it comes to subjects like ethics or human decision making, we've got to start thinking about it. It's not a straightforward situation. What's appropriate in one situation might not be in another. And so because of these contextual challenges, because we have to recognize that people are flawed, they're tired, we're biased, we can often make decisions, well-intentioned decisions that can be bad. It's a lot harder to codify those things. And so this temptation to codify everything leads you down a route where, well, let's just simplify things. Let's make a set of principles. And so the question I think we should ask ourselves is the thing that we are trying to codify, is it codifiable? Therefore, should we have hard and fast rules? Does that make sense? And there are going to be certain things where you want to do that. You just want to tell people exactly what to do. And there's no negotiation, because them doing exactly what you tell them to do will always produce the right answer. On other occasions, we have to give them a bit of agency to think for themselves. And so the ways that you might mitigate one type of risk are not necessarily the ways you might try and mitigate another. Now, that makes the world of the person writing the rules and creating the processes to manage the risk a lot harder. But that, I think, is the honest challenge that we're facing. And all too often we take comfort from having hard codified rules because that looks good, nice. It's nice and simple. But actually that doesn't reflect the realities. And so it's bridging that gap between the theory that we'd love to have, which is a simple set of rules, and the realities of the complex world that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as you were speaking then, it just reminded me how much in cybersecurity that we just love a hard and fast rule. And I think a lot of that's down to, historically, we've had to sort of say no to a lot of things because we've had to look after quite a big estate when the tooling hasn't really been there. It's only till, the last, 5-10 years that the tooling's really helped us be able to automate a lot of the stuff that human eyeballs just cannot physically keep an eye on. But I think that hard and fast rule still remains because of maybe sort of a self-preservationist attitude. We've saying no to a lot of things is easier when there's only 2 or 3 of you and a big team looking after a big organization from a cybersecurity perspective. How do you think, with that mindset still continuing, cybersecurity practitioners can think? I almost think it's a bit like sunken cost aversion. Like, they don't want to let go of things because they put so much effort into protecting these systems, and therefore they don't give their users autonomy.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because if you've spent a lot of time working on or designing systems and processes, we know from behavioral science that if we invest time in something, that we value it. And that's a good thing, right? Because we don't want to think I've just spent years or months or hours doing something that's pointless. None of us believes that, otherwise we wouldn't have done it in the first place. So we have a sort of certain if you like, bias towards the processes that we have designed or implemented. And there are good evolutionary reasons why that makes sense. And so it's sometimes difficult to give up the ways that we have always done things. And I think one of the things to recognize is that whatever system we design will have, to use medical terminology, side effects. Of course, let's not forget that side effects don't actually exist. Side effects are effects, but they're just the ones that we don't want. So we call them side effects to make it convenient. I think starting to recognize that whatever approach you adopt or have been adopting will have side effects, not because you're an idiot, but because it's impossible often to codify every single thing. Recognizing that fact means that you can then start to say, actually, if it's not working 100% the way it's intended, that's not because I'm a complete idiot. It's maybe because I've missed something, or it's not possible to design the perfect thing. So recognizing that is a really key start point. And, to the extent that when I work with my clients, I always say to people, if you're going to bring in new rules, make the person who's writing the rule disclose the side effects, make them consciously aware, so that when you're introducing it, you're not thinking we have nailed this. You are thinking this is an experiment. And if we think about rules and processes where we're trying to influence human behavior, it is not like programming a machine. A machine will slavishly follow the rules it has been given, sometimes in ways that we didn't contemplate. But you've got a certainty there because you tell the machine to do it and it goes off and does it. Humans don't work in that way. And so what we should recognize is that any attempt to influence people, and I talk in my book about, it's called Humanizing Rules, but rules is just a proxy for rules, process, policies, procedures, training, communication. Any attempt to influence people's behavior, that is an experiment. And we need to think about it in experimental terms. And so there are going to be times when our experiments, things that we do with the best intentions, are going to fail or not work as well as we'd hoped. Equally, there will be times where we surprise ourselves in a positive sense and they work much better than expected. And if you want a good example of that, think about advertising. There are certain ad campaigns that are just shouldn't work. It's ridiculous. So in the UK, if we think about price comparison websites, you've got little sort of meerkats advertising that, or opera singers advertising it in ridiculous jingles. Now, on any logical level, people shouldn't be tempted to buy a product because they're spoken to by some fake animal or opera singer. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And yet clearly those ads work. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep doing them. So there's an example of something counterintuitive. And often when we're looking to influence human decision-making, counterintuitive things work. And we need to be open to that as well. So if we treat this whole exercise as an experiment and recognize that when we're going in, it is likely that there are going to be situations we haven't thought of, circumstances may change. Rules that we've created for the analog world, to use a sort of example, may not work in the digital world. What works well in one culture or country might not work in another. COVID's a great example of where presumptions that people had made about things turned out to not work in that particular situation. And so if we start to think in experimental terms, I think then it's much easier to say to ourselves, well, let's be honest about when it hasn't worked and recognize that it may not be possible to get 100% compliance or 100% of a particular outcome. And you can if you throw the kitchen sink at it, but we need to work out where do we want to do that and not. But I think adopting this experimental mindset feels really alien to people because it's sort of like it's admitting that we don't have all the answers and we'd love to have a simple solution, a job done. That is not how people work. And so that experimental mindset, recognizing that there are going to be side effects, that there are likely to be unintended consequences, if we're aware of that, we can look out for them, we can monitor for them, and that makes it more likely that we'll find the right answer, or we won't continue to blunder down a path that's clearly not working.
Really interesting point. You just said there, monitoring. I think measurement in software and also in the people involved in software, because when we implement software metrics, I'd say a good chunk of them actually really are about the people, and that becomes really problematic. Whereas your example of the advert, well, you can measure some really solid metrics on whether or not an advertisement campaign is working. But how in the past have you dealt with kind of measuring the human element when you are running an experiment?
Yeah, it's a great point, right? So I talk a lot about we can learn from marketing, because marketing is obviously the business of influencing people, right? We spend money on ad campaigns to persuade people to buy a product or service, or in the case of governments, to behave in a particular way. And so if you then transfer that logic across, which I think is valid, you then say to yourself, okay, well, how do I know that I've been successful? Marketing is obvious because I will sell more of it may not be 100% down to the ad campaign, but you've got some form of visibility on how successful you're being. When your objective is to prevent bad things from happening, often there is no evidence. You know when it's gone wrong, but you don't necessarily know when it's going right. And of course, the worst, what you don't want to do is to sort of wait and say, well, we'll judge the success of this by nothing we've seen going wrong. That doesn't feel particularly safe. It's just waiting for something to happen to prove that you're out there trying to prove a negative. And so one of the things to think about is to say, well, what are the human objectives that we're trying to deliver? And often what we do is we look at the data sets that are convenient to us. So here's a good example. If we think about training, one of the things that we measure the success of training is how many people turned up to do the training, right? Either in person or online. A bum on a seat, or fingers on a keyboard, or eyes on a screen. Now, it feels like a logical metric to measure. 100% of people did the training, job done. Well, just because 100% of people showed up doesn't mean they've understood what you're telling them, doesn't mean they've accepted what you've told them. Okay, so how can we test that? Well, then the next logical thing we do is we test them seconds after we've taught them something. And we regurgitate some facts, and then we test things that are easy to test. And in my world of compliance, it's often questions like, failure to comply with this rule will see you go to jail for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. Right? Easy to test. What a ridiculous question, right? I don't want anybody ever going, oh, well, this rule's a 5-year and that's a 20-year. I better not break the 20-year rule, but the 5-year one, that's the one I'm going to breach. Right? It's stupid information. No one needs to know. You just need to know the consequences of not doing this are severe. That's about it. But we test those basically. We're not testing actual comprehension. And so I think we can take a lesson here out of teachers in schools and think about, are we just teaching people to pass an exam? Or do we want them to genuinely understand something? And if we want them to genuinely understand something, then we need to start thinking about, well, how can we measure that level of understanding? And then you get into the realms of, for example, phishing campaigns. Now, I think that's a really interesting idea that's not deployed in many other contexts. Now, partly because it is, if you think about it, a little bit unethical. So what we're doing is we're putting people in a position where you've set up, basically entrapment, right? You've set them up in a situation. And then what you do is when they fail your phishing test, you go, ha, you're bad. We've caught you. And there are lots of ethical questions about whether that makes sense. But the thinking behind it, I think, is sensible, which is the only way I'm going to have a handle on whether people within the organization are likely to fall for this, is to put them in a position where I can find out whether that's the case or not. Now, for me, the ethics in it comes in the way you handle it, not necessarily in setting up the scenario. And if you actually treated people decently and recognized that even the best intentioned human can get things wrong, then you could probably set that exercise up in a way that was a bit more ethical and was a bit more supportive and collaborative. So less of an entrapment exercise and more of a training one. But the reason I like the philosophy behind it, if not always the execution, is that what that recognizes is the only way I can find this out is to test it out for real. And that does two things. One is it puts your employees in a real life situation, or what they think is a real life situation if you do it well. But the second thing is you've then got a proper handle on the risk. You are measuring actually whether people are responding to these situations. What you then do with that is a secondary phase. But I think that's a good example of saying, okay, what is the behavioral outcome that we are looking for? And have we been successful in achieving that? So you're testing the actual thing that you want people to do or not do, rather than testing the theory as to whether they ought to do it. And I come back to that. We need to look, to think about not what we would like people to do, but what they are likely to do. How do we find out what they're likely to do? Well, we try and replicate the scenarios where we can watch that. Now, there are lots of examples of that where you can't do it. We don't want to put temptation in people's paths. It's not acceptable. It's not the right process. But the thinking behind it of saying, if I really want to know whether I've mitigated the risk, is I need to look at the people and try and understand what they will do in certain situations, then that's a really good start point. There are other things we can look at. For example, if there's a particular rule that is complex, where you would say, actually, if somebody's going to need to comply with this rule, they're going to need to understand the detail. And therefore, we might say to ourselves, are they inquiring for themselves? Are they asking the questions? So if there is a rule that you need to ask questions to be able to comply, I don't know, there are limits or things you need approvals for. Are we getting people asking for that at a time when we would expect it? So gifts and entertainment at Christmas is a good compliance example. As you approach the holiday season, people are more likely to be giving and receiving gifts. Therefore, that policy becomes more prevalent. Are people asking questions about that? Are they looking at that particular rule at that time of year? Doesn't necessarily mean that they're not complying with it if they're not, but it's a good leading indicator. And so one of the things I talk about in my book is using people as a radar. And often what we do is we use people, the evidence of non-compliance as a sort of, that's the test. So when it has gone right or it's gone wrong, where we can obviously measure that. But there are lots of other things, the interactions that we have with people where we can start to see things. Somebody complaining a lot about a particular rule, and I don't just mean one person, but take a broad sway. Lots of people. If one person complains about something, it's less of an issue. Lots of people are complaining about it. Then it's worth having a look at that rule, because lots of people complaining about a particular rule tells you they don't like it. Which rules are they likely to bend when push comes to shove? Answer is ones they have no respect for. So complaints about rules, we often tell people to go away and shut up. That's the way it has to be. And I'm not saying you listen to every single one, but if there's a wall of complaints about a particular rule or process or system, people go, oh, this system's tedious, clunky, keeps breaking down. Well, that's a leading indicator as to where something might go wrong. So rather than just using people as evidence that it hasn't worked, we can start to tap into things that they do, questions they ask, their behaviors before things go wrong that could, and we have to be really careful about how we interpret the data, that could be indicative of a problem down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing the sort of cybersecurity industry doesn't do very well is giving justifications for the controls they put in place. Quite often it's, well, we're security, we said so. That's why you're blocked from this website. That's why you're blocked from this, without any form of dialogue or discussion. And often the controls that cybersecurity practitioners put in place, it isn't through consultation. It is a response to the threat landscape. Whether or not that's a threat landscape that is tailored to that organization, thinking contextually, like, is this an actual threat to us, or is it just a general threat to any organization? What's the likelihood of that risk occurring? And then putting those controls in place without sort of going, oh, actually, Bob, the developer, needs to be able to access this system to be able to do his job and actually make the business profitable. And I think sometimes we forget that disconnect. But some of that, I think, is down to the fact that we don't allow a lot of psychological safety to have these discussions with the cybersecurity team, to sort of challenge them and say, well, why are you doing it this way? Why can't I be involved? Because some of the cybersecurity decisions are secret in a way. So how would you suggest go about breaking down those sort of psychological safety and silos in that way?
So I think you made a really, really good point early on, Leanne, which I think is worth just highlighting, which is about human beings are sentient. So when we force rules on them, force training on them, restrict what they can do, they will react to that. We will have a view on that. We've all come across rules that we think are dumb. We all break rules every single day. And so when we come across someone that has decided on our behalf that we can't do something, generally speaking, we'll find that irritating unless we understand the reasons why. And the classic one I always used to cite was in banks. And I don't know if this is still the case, but very often they used to block all video websites, right? Very simple. And when I was heading up compliance, I was like, I want to find out why, right? I'm a little bit mischievous with these things. And so I always like to find out why did rules. So I went and investigated. And I was told on several occasions, the reason that YouTube was blocked was it started off with bandwidth arguments, which I might buy under certain circumstances. I could see that bandwidth needs to be throttled, and you don't, during the World Cup or something, you don't necessarily want everybody to be streaming that kind of thing. But I think it's less of an issue now than it was before. So let's park that as a legit excuse. You then get into we don't want people watching inappropriate content. And I said, well, who's to judge what's inappropriate and what's not? And then it came down to, we don't want people spending their whole days watching cat videos. To which I say two things. One is, if somebody's spending their whole days watching cat videos, that's not a YouTube problem. That's a supervision issue. There's a bigger issues than there. And actually, does it matter if somebody wants to spend 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes watching a cat video, if that gives them joy and makes them laugh, right? How is that detrimental? And in any case, they can do it on their own personal devices anyway. So who are we to police this kind of stuff? And I said, we should be thinking much more sensitive about it, because if you block YouTube just as a sort of proxy for all these other risks, then what you're doing is stopping people accessing stuff that's really useful for work. And you don't know what that is. There's tons of training courses, video, things that might seem, particularly in the field that I'm in, there's lots of things that you can watch that actually teach you a lot about human decision making, and they're good for creativity and those sorts of things. And just by blanket going, well, we don't want YouTube, you are potentially shutting that off. And so you don't necessarily see the downside to these things because you don't know what it is they might be watching. And it sends a huge signal to employees that you don't trust them. And whenever we're in a position where somebody effectively signals that you're not trusted, then you're going to respond in kind. And I don't think that's a healthy relationship between employer and employee, to basically go, well, we can't trust you not to do inappropriate things, so we'll just have a blanket prohibition. It's a little bit like the parental logic of just do what I say, right? No negotiation. And I know why parents use that, because you get to a point where you have nothing else to reach for. But if you do that as an employer to adults, that poses problems. And so I think we shouldn't allow any function within one organization to have the sort of power that allows them, whatever the opposite of a golden ticket, a golden veto is on things. We should be escalating. The legal function does this quite a lot. You need to get approval from legal before it can happen. Well, why should legal have some kind of override on decisions that are made in the business? Because the answer is legal wants to make legal's life as easy as possible, right? So they'll look at it and say, what we want to do is, if we go to court on this one, we want to make sure it's buttoned up, so we're going to control what you do. I would be saying, okay, that's going to happen in a very small percentage of situations. Is the cost of that worth all the other imposition that you're imposing on lots of other people and how it makes them feel? And we allow legal to do that in their way. I think you're right. We also allow sort of decisions to be made by people who, with best intentions, none of this is meant to criticize people making a decision, which have unintended consequences. So I do think organizations need to start recognizing that when we give people too much power, when they're mitigating a risk, they will do everything they can to mitigate that risk. But if you take it to a logical extremity, what's the best way to protect an organization from cyber risk is not have any computers, right? Let's not give anyone access to any systems whatsoever. Ditto, physical security will say no buildings, right? HR might say we don't employ any people. They will mitigate those risks. We don't allow that to happen. We say these are the risks that are here. You need to help us mitigate them. And there are going to be times where we're going to say, no, I know it make life easier for you, but that's not acceptable. That impinges on other aspects of employment. And I think that's not been thought through fully, because actually, if we irritate employees in one context, compliance is a good example, but you could say, being ridiculously petty with cyber issues and making people do silly things there has an impact on how I feel about working for this particular organization. And if I start to perceive the organization has stupid rules that I don't respect, then actually it might not be a cyber rule that gets my wrath. I may well go, well, screw them, and I'll find any opportunity to exact my revenge. And that might be in some other context. So all of this feeds into the employee experience. And I think it's just important for organizations to recognize that people managing risk, if you incentivize them to do everything that's convenient for them, that comes at a cost elsewhere. And so we should be having these discussions and saying, yes, of course, we need to mitigate the risk, but there's got to be a path where we risk accept that we're not going to be able to nail everything down. So work out what it is that's absolutely essential. And then you say, well, this would be nice to have, but if that impinges normal business practices, maybe we'll have to think about it differently. I think stupid rules actually are detrimental on two levels. One is because they don't capture everything and we pretend that they do. But the second thing is they piss people off. And so what you do is if you come across a stupid rule, you find a way around it. And therefore, actually, that's more dangerous because you've then effectively encouraged non-compliance. Whereas what you should be doing is finding out how can we create a safe environment that can work with us, recognizing that people are going to want to do the very things that we've hired them for in the first place.
Absolutely. And some workarounds are just so heavy-handed. I recall joining an organization and I got really really friendly with the developers very quickly as a cybersecurity person, which is exactly what you want. You want people to sort of tell you their sins, as it were. And they were just like, can you do something about Bluetooth? And I was like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, Bluetooth is completely banned from our devices. And so what we've been doing is we've been going online, we've been pulling a script from online that bypasses all the security controls. We don't know where the scripts come from, by the way. We just pulled it offline. And the only reason why we want Bluetooth is because we like to listen to music on our wireless headphones while we're coding. And I had to just go back to the security team and just be like, we need to lift this because this script, we have no idea what it's doing and we're actually preventing them from being productive. And there's just so many occasions in the workplace where what's the point of hiring good creative people if we don't trust them to make good decisions? Particularly in the technical space, I think we should give them, even more leeway than we would do. Sort of maybe the average user who isn't so technically minded, put a few more guardrails, a few more bits of training in place there. But people who are technically minded, that one-size-fits-all approach, I really just don't think works. And I think a lot of, we were talking about training earlier, things like security awareness, for example. When you do that once a year training, when you first start in an organization, then once a year, every year since in your employment, it's the same training for every single person, regardless of what level you're at. And I just don't think it captures the nuances of different experiences, different expertise, and the different sort of cultural surroundings that those people are involved in dealing with your estate and the organization. So I think it's a really interesting point you were making about giving people that autonomy, because they will just turn on you and will try and do other things, and those workarounds are so much more dangerous.
And I think there's an opportunity here as well, right? Which is if you allow people to tell you what they would like to do and can't, for whatever reason. Let's assume you've got things, because there's some you can't just sort of say do what the hell you want and we'll worry about the rules after. But that's where the experimental mindset kicks in. I think if you introduce rules and restrictions, so the Bluetooth one would be a good example. Let's assume we're super well intentioned, right? And these things generally are super well intentioned. And you start off and say, okay, we've introduced this thing, release it, and then have a mechanism whereby people for whom that is a problem, and ideally do this before you introduce it, but a little bit like legislation, right? That you consult with people to find out what the impact of this is likely to be, and you review it to make sure that you've got it right. And I think the Bluetooth one's a good example where you could say, look, we're going to ban this and let's explain why, and let's explain it in simple language for people that are not, but people that are techie, right, that are interested. And Bluetooth's not a particularly techie thing, right? The vast majority of people probably have Bluetooth headphones, so it's something that we intuitively understand. But there'll be other things, maybe there's the introduction of a new browser that makes things easier for people or does something clever, or there's a bit of software that people want, or there's some sort of need that they have and you've blocked it. I think it's very smart to have a process where you can allow people to come and talk to you, not in a kind of they come and tell you and then you close another loophole but actually how do you facilitate what it is they're trying to do? Now, it might be that you can't facilitate 100% what they want. You can find another path to allow them to do it, but recognize that you're going to get these things wrong. And so even if you've thought it through brilliantly, is the sort of feedback loop that you were talking about, Eliane, is doesn't tend to exist except in an unofficial capacity. And the only way these things tend to change is you get senior people going, this rule is ridiculous, right? And it's be something that impacts them. So things like travel policy, expense policy, conflict of interest stuff, ability to access certain things, that tends to get changed because senior person shouts a lot. And therefore they get their work. And it always typically starts with, well, we'll just grant an exception for them, right? We'll let them have access to those websites and not everybody else. And I think that's a flawed approach. You should be recognized, every single human being. And I think it's particularly important where it applies to larger swathes of people, because actually, if you've got hundreds of people who have a problem with this, that's hundreds of brains who will be looking at ways to get around your rules, as opposed to the CEO that just can shout a lot because they probably haven't got the time to focus on some of these things. But if it's impacting every aspect of your day job, you're going to find ways around it. And so I'm a big fan of consulting, introducing ethical hacking. So get the very people who are likely to be irritated by your rules to come and talk to you and to show you how, and reward them for coming forward and showing you how they can get around your rules. Because again, you won't have designed it perfectly, and humans are ingenious at finding ways around problems. And so I think we need to create a culture saying we haven't nailed this down perfectly. We need your help with this. And actually, if you come to us and give us your help, that's not going to make your life tougher. It's going to make your life easier. And people they'll come forward with all sorts of things you hadn't even realized. And that using humans as an early warning system that way, I think is super powerful. And all of this, I think, involves around treating people like they're adults. Typically, we treat every single employee like they're the biggest master criminal out there and they're up to no good all the time. time. A very small percentage will be up to no good, but what you do by chasing them is you irritate everybody else. And sometimes that's not worth doing. Catch the criminals out by other means, but work on the basis that everybody else is trying to do the right thing and is turning up to work trying to be as effective as possible.
What you're describing there is a kind of a much more dynamic environment, much more agile and iterative, not trying to push it too much into a Scrum context, but much more iterative and collaborative way of working. And I think that is probably very far away from what people would imagine when they think about policies and rules and compliance. I mean, do you think cybersecurity professionals or cybersecurity teams would benefit from behavioral scientists or behavioral science training in their teams?
Yes, I think, and of course, right. Let's also declare my own bias here, right? This is the basis on the work that I do. So of course I'm going to say that, but let me explain. Yes, and let me explain why. Because if we are designing things for human beings, whether that's controls, processes, communication, the things that I used the proxy rules for earlier on. If we're designing that for human beings, wouldn't it be a good idea to have some understanding about how effective that is going to be? We don't. Let's take a totally different context. Let's think about animals, right? If we are trying to influence animals in some way, shape, or form, so that might be trying to heal them. We're in a different context where we're trying to influence. We research animals, and we don't put people in that position without having some understanding of it. If you're trying to be an architect, you have to understand the basic rules about how you do things, the laws of physics, engineering, all those sorts. And so I find it bizarre that we have lots of professions out there, and compliance is my flagship one, but I would extend it to other areas that are trying to do these things, where we do it on intuition. We do it on what we have always done, what seems sensible. But when we look at other contexts, in marketing, the obvious example, we know that often what's effective at influencing human decision-making is illogical, is pointless. Go back to COVID. One of the lessons that was fascinating for me was every single person in the world suddenly understood what compliance was. Not because they'd never experienced anything, but it was suddenly there because we were all faced with a massive set of rules, principles, cross your fingers and pray type exhortations by government to change the way, fundamentally change the way that we behave in many aspects. And we all experienced things where we went, well, that's it. That's ridiculous. That's irritating. Okay, I'm prepared to accept that. We all had our tolerance thresholds for it, but we reacted to it and we saw what was effective and what was ineffective. And, to take the UK as an example, if I just say the two words Barnard Castle, everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Which is this. So just in case there are any listeners that don't, Dominic Cummings, who was the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson's advisor, is probably stretching it too far because he was much more, he was basically right-hand man, almost the power behind the throne, you might think, broke COVID rules and then lied about it and basically went on national television trying to claim that he had some excuse for breaking rules that the vast majority of the population were abiding by. That, for me, is a classic example. We know what hypocrisy looks like. We understand those dynamics and the human dynamics behind it. And we know why that is so irritating. Not just the rule breaking, one law for them, another one for us, but the lying about it as well. Add all that together and you've got a visceral reaction to a compliance type situation. So we all understand that. And so given we've been through that experience, one of the things I say to anyone who's writing rules or trying to influence people is that you've got an instinctive understanding of what this is, when this is, when it feels awful, when it isn't working in the way that is intended and things that might go wrong. Now, don't just run on that instinct and go, oh, this is how it feels to me. Because one of the other challenges that we know from behavioral science is that it's something called the curse of knowledge. The more we know about a subject, the harder it is for us to put ourselves in the position of someone that doesn't. And if you're an expert in something, you are steeped in this stuff, you get it, your technical knowledge will be very high, your awareness of the risks will be very high. It is really hard for you to put yourself in a position of someone that doesn't get it, someone that knows nothing about this particular thing. And so we mustn't run on gut instinct in that situation. What we must do is to try and find out what it is like from their perspective, put ourselves in their shoes, really tread carefully around that. But use that visceral gut reaction that you had to some aspect of the COVID dynamic and say, okay, rules as designed theoretically do not always work. We need to understand that. So if you take that, plus that recognition that you can't easily always put yourself in other situations, you're going to make a real effort to do it. Suddenly you can start to see how, if my job is trying to influence other people, that maybe having an understanding of how that works could be incredibly helpful because it'll help me to get a better answer than if I just do it by guesswork or the thing that we've always done. And the big risk is that when things don't work out, what people tend to do is double down on what they've done before, right? So population doesn't do what we want. More training, right? More training, more controls, more reviews, more blah, 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 blah. What happens if the training is the problem? And one of the challenging things that I do with lots of my clients is to say, guess what? maybe we should do less. Maybe you've just done that bit too much, or do something completely different. And that feels really risky, right? Removing a control, doing less training, but that might be the answer. And so we have to be open to the fact that the approaches that we have adopted thus far, if they are not working, then maybe doing more of the same isn't the right answer. Maybe we need to try something different.
And it's about kind of putting your ego aside when you're doing stuff like that, when making those hard recognitions that, yeah, maybe you're not right in this instance. And I think in terms of cybersecurity, one of the sort of mantras that you always hear in conferences, wherever you go, is the foundation of security is people, processes, and technology. But we always really focus predominantly on the tech side, kind of like the silver bullet that's going to protect us. But when it comes to the people and processes side, I think we'll do really badly at engaging people. The language we use is just horrific to describe people. If someone clicks on a phishing link, for example, quite often the mantra is, oh, well, they're stupid. It's nothing to do with the fact that maybe we haven't trained them right. Maybe we haven't prepared them for this type of attack. No, they're stupid. They clicked on the link. We say things like zero trust to describe our threat landscape. That sounds great. That really is going to endear me. And we call people the weakest link. Could they be our strongest link? Which is the sort of thing I'm trying to push at the moment, is try and change that mindset of, these people are only smart at the things we teach them, tell them, show them. But if we gatekeep all that knowledge, they're never going to learn, and they're never going to be that great asset that they could be. Because going back to a point I made earlier, there's only ever a few of us in cybersecurity teams in most organizations. Unless you're a massive organization, your cybersecurity team is usually really tiny. If you have one at all, sometimes that's just ingested by the IT teams. So you've got to do a lot with a little. And, you mentioned earlier about when things go wrong, testing positives, testing negatives, how can you prove that something is working if you haven't been breached? Doesn't mean that you haven't stopped attacks, but there's just this whole sort of narrative behind that. You just have no idea. So when you're thinking about, as I say, it's people, process, technology, how do we get cybersecurity individuals to focus away from their reliance on technology to keep our organization safe and leverage our people against a common cyber threat?
Yeah, so I think I'm reminded of the old joke about, there are only two industries in the world that refers to its customers as users, and that's drug dealers and the IT industry. And I think it's a joke, but there is something in that. And I think it's almost the attitude is sometimes, oh, well, if it wasn't for those pesky people sitting behind a key, it's almost like the Scooby-Doo logic. If it wasn't those pesky kids, right, everything would be okay. If it wasn't for those pesky users doing stupid things with their systems, we'd be fine. And the phishing test example that you give, I think, is a really, really good one. So I have a very simple mantra, and I use it in the context of rules, but we can apply it to what you're talking about here, which is to say, if one or two people break a rule, then you've probably got a people problem. If lots of people are breaking a rule, you've got a rule problem. So let me just unpick that. So what I'm saying is, if lots of people are able to comply with a particular rule, but a few people can't or won't, then that suggests that the problem is with those people. Because if everybody else can manage to do it, but they can't, why is that? Now, it might be they're in a very, very unique set of circumstances that explain why that's happening. So I wouldn't rule that out. But broadly speaking, if most people can comply with something and a couple of people can't, then it points to the people being the problem. But if you've got lots of people not doing something, then the likelihood is that there will be some reasonable explanation, at least from their perspective. And so we automatically assume that, oh, we've got widespread miscreants, lots of people not following this rule. If you dive into that, often you find there's a really good reason that's driving that. It's not them setting out to break the rules, because the vast majority of people come to work every day trying to do the right thing, right? They're not deliberately setting out to screw up. So if you've got a lot of them screwing up, from your perspective, try and find out what the cause of that is. And the analogy I always use is traffic. Of course, we hold people accountable for when they have accidents, but when we have a stretch of road where there are lots of accidents, we don't just always sit there and blame the drivers. What we do is we look at say it's a junction, we go look at that junction and say, what is it about this junction that is causing large numbers of accidents to occur here? We always draw conclusions about what can we do to change the junction to make it safer. That's not about letting drivers off, but it's about recognizing that the environment somehow caused the problem. The consistent factor is this particular junction or certain weather conditions or whatever it is, and therefore we change the junction to make it safer. I would argue the same thing with things like phishing campaigns. Lots of people falling for them actually might not be them being idiots. It might be that, as you say, your training is terrible. And so putting yourself in the shoes of other people and recognizing that this narrative that we often have of, oh God, someone's not done something, they're an idiot. Well, they might be an idiot, and we're all capable of being idiots on some level, but there will be some reason why they came to the conclusion that that was the appropriate course of action. Very small percentage, as I said, will be doing it to break rules. But what's fascinating about that very small percentage is that if they are deliberately setting out to do something malicious, they're probably going to be hiding their tracks. They will pass all of the stuff that's obvious, right? If you really, really are an undercover, nefarious agent, you're not going to appear on radars of doing stupid things, because you don't want to get caught doing that. So we need to catch them by different means anyway. They're not listening to training. If they are, they're looking for loopholes. But what we need to start to do is to recognize that the reason humans make decisions is on some level, there is something telling them to do that. Now, it might be that it's past experience that is useless, that they've always done something a particular way. It's irrelevant. They've come in from a different industry. They've never seen something like this before. We've explained it piss poorly, and therefore it's not clear to them. We think we've explained it clearly, but obviously we haven't. So the focal point, I think, really needs to be thinking about things from their perspective. And what fascinates me about most companies is that there's lots of effort put into customer experience. So we try and make things as easy as possible for customers, as slick as possible, because, well, hey, they pay the bills. And if we don't do that, they'll go to a competitor. That same logic is not deployed when it comes to employees with regards to compliance, training, restrictions, controls. Now, it's not the same relationship, and I'm not saying, the employee is always right? We can push employees to a certain extent. We have legal rights over them. What I call the employment contract fallacy. And the reason I say it's the employment contract fallacy is employment contract does legally give you the right to tell your employees what to do. And there are going to be times where you want to exercise that, no question. But we shouldn't rely on it all the time, because if we're pissing them off and asking them to do silly things, they are going to respond in kind. And if we want them to do things when we can't see what they're up to, when we don't actually, maybe we don't even know that it's happening, we'll find out afterwards, then we need to work with them and we need to think about things. And so stuff that is particularly irritating for employees is, yes, of course we can get away with it and we'll do it to a certain extent. There are going to be times where you just want them to follow the rules, but there's lots of other times where you just go, should we really push them? And so the biggest question I think people can ask, if you want to find out where you have a potential weak point in your thing, is ask this simple question, which is, what pisses you off? And I phrase it in that slightly crude way deliberately, because I'm not interested in things that are slightly annoying. I'm interested in things that viscerally irritate the hell out of you, that you do not understand or do not accept, because that is a weak point. Because a rule or a law or a process that you don't respect is one you're going to try to circumvent. So that question, or a derivative of it, but it needs to be really provocative. If you get lots of people coming back with the same answer, that's a really good piece of feedback that you should action and not ignore. And it may be that you can't change the underlying process, but you can then think about, well, why do they think that? Maybe we haven't explained it properly. Maybe we can break this thing up to make it simpler. Maybe there's a one time where they need to do something that we're blocking that we could find a way through. But that is a key bit of feedback. And I think we don't listen to those people. Their views are almost irrelevant. It's a sort of take it or leave it thing. A bit like when I download a piece of software or an app, I'm required to accept terms and conditions. Right, we all just click through that stuff because there's no point in reading it, because I can't negotiate. I can't turn around to Apple or whoever and go, I don't like this. Right, I just have to take it or leave it, and I want to use the software. And that mechanism, and they know that as well, right? They know no one bothers reading this stuff, but there are certain legal constraints on it. We would hope that they won't have put anything outrageous in there, and we'll hope that it wouldn't stand up in court if it ever came to it. But when we're talking about employees, we shouldn't be putting them in that position where they just treat us like a thing to be got past. We need to work with them, and that involves showing them respect and empathy.
Your book talks about the Humans Framework. Could you tell us and the listeners about it, please, and how you'd apply it to a typical situation in an organisation, kind of in the context of cybersecurity?
Sure. So Humans is one of the frameworks that's in the book. And what I've tried to do here is this is not about every single aspect that will drive human decision-making, but it is a start point of some factors to consider for one of two situations. Either if you are designing something and you want to design, and by something, I mean rule, training, communications, all of these things I use under the proxy of the word rules. If you're designing something, blank sheet of paper territory, you can start to think about, well, what will this feel like from the perspective of the target audience? In other words, the people that are going to have to follow this. You can also use it as a diagnostic tool where if people aren't doing what you want them to do, you can say, let's have a look at these factors and see if we can identify reasons why that might not be working. So it works both ways. And the idea behind it is there are a number of factors that we can think about that give us a sense of people's propensity to do what we want them to do, or in the case of something we're trying to stop, not to do that particular thing. And so it's an acronym. So each letter of the word stands for something different, and it's a dynamic that should set you off. So I'll take you through those very quickly, and then maybe we can think of an example to look at it. So the H of humans stands for helpful. And the idea behind that is think about from the perspective of the people you're trying to influence, so the employees, is what you are expecting or asking them to do helpful? I don't mean helpful from the perspective of the organization. I don't mean theoretically helpful from their perspective. I mean, genuinely, does this help? Does this take them further in their day or not? So if it's a health and safety thing, right, if it stops them getting killed or injured, they are more likely to, and they recognize that, they're more likely to find it helpful. It's not theoretically whether they should, it's practically whether they do. And we're talking all the time about things from their perspective. Second one is understand. And the question there simply is, do they understand it? And there's two things that you want to ask whether they understand. The first one is, do they understand what it is you want them to do? Because if you don't understand something, there is a lower likelihood of you actually being able to. You might randomly comply with the rule or requirement or do the right thing, but you might not. So the more we understand something, the more capable we are of doing it. Equally, the more capable we are of not doing it. So it's also worth that flip side. The second thing that's worth thinking about from an understand perspective is not just what they think about it, but what they think you think. And I'll unpick that. What that basically means is, if you're asking them to do something, do they think you understand what it is you are asking? Because very often we get instructions from on high that seem really, or from an authority that seem really easy, even theoretical, but are practically a pain in the butt. If I feel that you don't understand what you're asking me to do, you have no appreciation of the realities, that will potentially reduce my propensity to comply with things. So understand's a little bit complex, has all those nuances. M is manageable, which is how easy is it for somebody to do something? And we need to think about whether actually complying with this rule is going to be easy for them or not. And if something is harder, that is obviously makes it less likely that they're going to do. It doesn't mean they won't, but it's just worth recognizing and saying, is this actually a massive pain in the backside? Can they actually comply with this? And often we impose rules on people, silly rules that make sense from a theoretical perspective, but stop something legitimate from happening. And so can they actually comply with this? Does this apply in all situations, or at the time this might not apply? A is then acceptable, which is basically saying, is the rule acceptable to them? And this is not a legal question. This is a moral, ethical, sort of societal question about, do I think you have the right to tell me to? Do I think you've got the right to block me watching YouTube? Can you tell me as an employer that I can't have social media accounts? At some point, there are going to be restrictions that we put on people that they find unacceptable. Just because you can legally do it doesn't necessarily mean. The more acceptable I find it, the more likely I am to do it. The less acceptable, the less likely I am. And of course, that's a measure not just of what you're doing within the organization, other rules, but it's also other experiences people have. And we saw with COVID, government overreach. You can't tell me to do that. That same feeling will apply in an employment situation. And so if somebody has a friend who's working for a similar company and they don't have any of these restrictions on them, then that's going to feel weird. And so we will calibrate what's acceptable to us based on our past experience, but also things that are there. And so again, not saying that we make if we need some people to do something, then we just need to recognize if it is less acceptable to them, then we might have to work a bit harder at it, because it just illustrates that people might be less likely to want to do it. N is normal. That's basically saying, is this something that's regular, normal, standard for an employment situation, for the industry, for the society that you're in? Is this a normal thing they're asking me, or is it weird? And the weirder, the more abnormal it is, the less likely we are to want to do it, the more it'll stand out. And again, not saying that we change anything, but just recognize the dynamics that were there. S is the most difficult one to explain, which is why it's last, which is S is for salient. And salient is a word that basically means, has it grabbed my attention? Am I aware of it? And so if we drive the Barbie advertising campaign for movies, that is very, very salient. That pink screams out on posters, unless you're colorblind, of course, in which point it's less. So things that stand out, but after a while, of course, those ads become less salient because we've seen them so frequently. So salience has it grabbed my attention? Is it there? So partly that's about, do they even know that this is a thing? Have we taught them? Are they aware of this particular thing? Or is it uppermost in their minds at a particular point in time? And we often train people on things in the classroom and maybe during their induction training. We don't think about, is this likely to be salient to them when it matters? And if we've got a particular process thing we need them to think about at a moment in time, then if we can identify ways to communicate it to them when it's relevant, it'll seem more salient. Rules about what you can do when you're traveling seem more relevant when you are about to go traveling. So the airline safety briefing, we don't send them a YouTube link 6 months before you get on the plane. You get it just before you're about to take off, when it is most relevant, therefore most likely to get through to you because it's salient. So the factors in humans there are things that we can think about to recognize whether something is landing well. I'll put it in very loose terms to continue the aviation analogy, landing well with our population. And therefore, what we can do is start to say, well, where do we have particular challenges? Now, some of these things might not apply in all situations, but we may, when we come across something that we're trying to review or design, we may say to ourselves, there are one or two of these that stand out, right? It's either particularly positively or particularly negatively. And that's where we can start to play with it and say to ourselves, what can we do? So if something is deemed to be incredibly unhelpful, it's a pain in the butt, I hate this thing, can we make it less of a pain in the butt? Or do we say to ourselves, okay, they think it's a pain in the butt, maybe I can make it feel like it's less of a pain in the butt, chunk it up, break it up, whatever. Or I might say, there's nothing I can do about it. It's the worst god-awful thing. Are there other factors I can play with? Can I move the dial elsewhere, recognizing that that one can't shift? And maybe if I can make the overall burden on people feel different by making it, I don't know, it's incredibly unhelpful, but we've made it really easy for them. It's incredibly unhelpful, but we've explained to them why we have to do this, and therefore their level of understanding is increased, and therefore it compensates for it. So that's basically how it works. And people often say to me, is there a scale there? The answer is you can, but the trouble is, how do you quantify helpfulness as opposed to salience, right? It starts to become very, very judgmental. And so, if you had a scale of 0 to 100 for each, I'm not sure that one dial point of helpfulness equates to one dial point of understanding, or vice versa. So you can use it in that, and you can of course compare A and B and say in terms of helpfulness, which one scores higher and lower. That you can do, but within it, not particularly helpful. But so people often try and quantify it. It's not designed for that, but you can do that. So pick something that you want people to do or not do.
Okay, I don't want them to click on unsolicited emails for potential risk of, could be a fish.
Okay, so let's just quickly go through that. So is that rule helpful? Well, the question would be, right, what is their understanding of that particular rule? Do they know why that rule is there? And is your implementation of that rule clunky in the sense that your decision to police that is basically quarantine any email that looks at all, or you're going to remove links from emails? Mm-hmm. Right. If it's just we don't want you to do this, and you've explained to you why, and it doesn't impact my life, I might go, well, that's not, maybe it's neutral on it, or actually it's quite helpful, right? They're trying to protect us. We don't want to fall for stuff. But if you're chucking anything that looks moderately suspicious somewhere else where I may not see it, I could miss a whole load of things. If you prevent me from clicking through legitimate links, then that starts to get unhelpful. So the helpfulness piece isn't necessarily the substance, it's maybe how you've responded to it. So I judge there and say, what are we doing at the moment, or what are we proposing to do? How does that feel on a helpfulness scale? The more of a pain you are, the more you make me do extra work, the less helpful you are, the more I feel like sense of protection you're there. So that's helpful. You, for understanding, is a question of how well have you trained them? Have you taught them why this matters, or have you just said, don't do this? Right. And you haven't illustrated why that's a potential risk. And of course, remember, all of these things are from their perspective. So if we're looking at helpful as an example, how does it feel to me? And the understanding is a very, very personal thing. So it's not about should they theoretically, do they actually understand it? Have you got it through to them? Have you told them stories about where things have gone wrong? Have you shown them how they could lose money in their own bank account? It could, if it can impact them personally, then that's a much stronger message. So the understanding bit is again, you have to make a judgment call about it. M for manageable depends what you're asking them to do. Are you asking, do you want them to go to a quarantine box anytime anything with a link comes in? Well, that starts to become less manageable than if it's just watch out when these things come through. Chances are there'll be some forms of restriction. Are you sure you want to click this link type warnings? How many of those do they have to click? How easy is it? What volume of emails are people getting? For somebody who gets very few emails, then managing the process of thinking this through is much easier than someone that's getting stacks of them. So is there a way that you can look at that and say heavy email users, or at least those getting the most, maybe we need to focus on those people separately and not burden people who pose a lower risk with some of these challenges. So manageable, again, very personal. And to your point, Leanne, we need to think about the risks that people pose. For the email thing, anybody who is receiving more emails from outside or more clickable emails, on the one hand, means they pose a greater risk because there's more of them coming in volume-wise. But equally, it means that maybe they're more savvy about these things because they've seen it more frequently. The flip side of that being, of course, you get comfortable and you just, I know what I'm doing. This is not for me. I don't pay any attention. So there's a balancing act here, but the manageable will depend on their individual circumstances. Acceptable will depend entirely on what you are asking them or telling them to do as to whether they want to accept what you're saying. If it blocks emails, if it restricts what they can do, that's potentially unhelpful. I love lots of organizations have phishing buttons where you get something in, you can send it, you just click the button, it gets rid of the problem. That, I think, is a good example. I used to use that for bureaucratic processes I thought were ridiculous internally. Click it, get rid of the problem. Well, no, because I always used to say, like, they would say, "This is not a phishing campaign, it's a serious email." I said, that can't be right, because this looks so stupid and bureaucratic that it just looked like a phishing campaign to me. No serious function within this organization would send something that ridiculous. Forget it. That's a clearly phishing campaign. Right? Those people should then go on a training course, right? Because they are actually undermining your program. That is a really good proxy metric for, are people aware of it, right? So they have thought about it. They know to send it to you. All of those things, brilliant, right? Tick, tick, tick. I'm not saying that you measure it absolutely and go, lots of people did that, so it's successful, but it's a good indicator that at least those people you've got through to. But I would be sending the creator of the email and the whole of that team on special training for 2 reasons. One is they have not thought this through, and therefore they clearly don't understand the substance of it. So extra homework for them. But the second thing is, if you're in a position to send emails like that out, you are holding in your hand a weapon of mass destruction from an undermining the cybersecurity program. And so they need to go through special training. So one of the things I'd be looking at for those things is to support your program is you don't want anybody sending something internally that could be mistaken for that particular thing, that could cause levels of concern, extra work for you, and demonstrates a general lack of cyber hygiene within the organization. So I'd be targeting people like that and saying, we need to hit those hard. You'll make fans with everybody because nobody likes receiving tedious bureaucratic emails. But secondly, it's a serious point, is they don't understand the substance. And that's a great bit of evidence that one might otherwise miss. Tick success for people got in touch with you, absolute big red cross for that function. And they should be sitting an extra, that shouldn't be everybody needs to have greater cyber. There you go. You've got some evidence that this particular function and probably others like it aren't there. That I think is powerful. Where do we got to? M for manageable, A for acceptable. Well, what are you asking me to do? Is it particularly difficult or clunky? How does that feel to me relative to? And remember that lots of cyber experiences are things that we compare with our private lives. One of the joys for me for working for myself is that I get to decide which software the company uses, right? And so I have stopped using lots of bits of software that I had, I thought were the only bits of software in town for corporates, because I just think they're awful, they're clunky, they're not great, they don't do what I need them to do. Now, I'm not suggesting that big companies should allow employees to use what the hell they want. There's good reasons why we restrict that. But the benchmark for user friendliness, usability, what makes a sensible restriction is people's private lives. And so if the UX on a particular system is clunky, people are going to compare that to Netflix. They're going to compare it to stuff that they use in their private lives. Often we think about the benchmark and going, well, this is, by our standards, this is very good. That's not good enough. And particularly when people are working remotely, the comparator, and this also brings us on to Salient, what grabs people's attention, the bar has been raised massively by the pandemic. Because if you're sitting at home, your comparator isn't Microsoft blah, it's whatever other things I use. And so we need, that's the game, that's the game changer. It's the game changer for grabbing people's attention, but it's also the quality of the user experience. So things that are acceptable and let's bring us into normal. We shouldn't be comparing just to work scenarios. We should be going, what do these feel like in life? And would we put a customer through this? And if we wouldn't put a customer through this, why the hell do we think it's okay to put an employee? Because guess what? They're both human beings. So acceptable is how acceptable do I find what being asked to do? Normal is this a standard process? Are you getting me to do something that is so weird that if I were to do it in my private life, I'd be balking at it? Probably worth rethinking, particularly where you've got people remotely, because they are maybe going to be multitasking between their personal stuff and their work stuff and flipping between devices. And if I'm not doing it on my own personal device, then I might need some help in explanations as to why that makes sense for that bit. So all of these comparators with people's private lives, I know it sounds facetious, people go, well, we're not Netflix or we're not whatever. We should be thinking in those terms. So acceptable will compare to what else am I being asked to do within work? What else do I see other people? I'm not saying they're the same, right? And we can impose, but we just need to be, that should be the benchmark for thinking about these things. So acceptable is that acceptable? Normal, is that something I ordinarily do? We're all used to the idea of email being sent to a spam folder, right? If you've got Gmail at home, that same thing happens. So that idea is fine. But if you want me to then go log into some hyper complicated system that I can't remember the password for, that you've made hyper secure, which traps things in there for decades, and I have to answer 500 questions to get them out, not desperately. And you want things that learn. So I don't mind going through a tedious, it's acceptable to me to have to go through a tedious process once to whitelist a particular domain or a particular type of email. If I have to do it every time, something that may be acceptable the first time may not be the second, third, fourth, or fifth. And the more times I have to do it, the more annoying it becomes. So acceptable can shift over time. Normal, we've talked about. And then Salient, the question would be there, well, how do you know whether it's salient or not? Well, people coming forward and saying, here's a problem. It's clearly salient to those people. They have thought about it. And one of the things you might want to do with that exercise is to say, okay, let's imagine this was a nefarious phishing email. We know it's not, right? What percentage of people thought in those terms? And is there anything that we can learn from that might inform how successful we've been? Maybe there's a particular area of the business that's responded really well. And therefore we'd say, look, they seem to be more cyber aware. And actually, maybe there's a note to go out to the people in that function, not the head of the function, go, congratulations, there's something about your people's culture that's great. So the negative message to the purveyors of this awful email is but there's a positive one to those people, say thank you so much. Can we learn anything about why it was more salient for those people than others? And so, that's a really good illustration. And I think that's a perfect example of where you might say, we don't need to send a phishing email to that team, because they've just demonstrated that they've got it. Let's not focus it there. Let's focus our efforts somewhere else. So we can learn things from that particular piece. But if we wanted to know from their perspective, it's like, well, what evidence do we have for them being cyber aware or not? And that's the logic that leads you to phishing campaigns. So that's a quick sort of run through of the ways that one might think about using the framework.
Amazing. Now, we could talk all day, Christian, I'm sure.
I definitely can. Yeah.
I think your humans framework, if that's not an indication for our listeners to run out and buy your book, I don't know what is, because I think in terms of cybersecurity, I can think of so many ways we could apply this into all the sort of interventions we try and do. On that note, Christian, please do plug your book, plug your podcast. I think everyone should hear what you do.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much. So easiest place to find me if people want to connect, and please do feel free. I know they say on LinkedIn, don't connect with anyone you don't know, but if you've been listening to me on the show and you've got this far through, then go for that. Just search for Human Risk on LinkedIn and you'll find me. The podcast is humanriskpodcast.com. There you can find all the episodes. We're up to about 240 something episodes and a ton more in the can already. So that's going to keep going for some time. Then the book is Humanizing Rules. And if you just go to humanizingrules.com, you can read the first few chapters for free. My publisher has generously put that out there so you can get a flavor for whether it's the sort of thing you like or not. So those places, so humanriskpodcast.com and humanizingrules.com will get you well and truly into my world.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that trip down memory lane with Christian Hunt. We will be back in September with all new content, but in the meantime, for the rest of August, we will be diving into the vaults and also hitting up some of our other friends and shows that we've been on to share some wonderful and interesting content. So do stick around, do keep listening. We need it, we need the attention.
Links to everything Christian discussed in this episode can be found in the show notes. And if you like the show, please do leave us a review and a share on LinkedIn or in your teams. It really helps us spread the word and get high quality guests like Christian on in future episodes.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time. Keep secure and don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?